Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I came across an interesting study this morning, and it was one linked by Dr. Brad, who gave his own intake on it, and it made me think of something. It made me realize that we all have our different biases here, and I'll get into that in a minute. And that's the interesting thing when it comes to science and why there's so many disputes of this stuff, is not that the data says certain things. It's the way that we interpret the data and apply it to the real world that oftentimes causes problems. Because, I mean, data is only data. You can draw whatever conclusions you want from the data. And I thought it was interesting because in this particular study, Dr. Brad had said, who again, his focus is on bodybuilding, right? His focus is on bodybuilding. And he had a focus on that before he ever got his degree and his PhD and all of that. So that's where his area is. Whereas in someone like me, I'm more interested in strength training and strength sports and athleticism far more than bodybuilding. I have no real interest in bodybuilding. So that alone gives us all bias in how we interpret the data. Because what was interesting in this study, they compared two different exercises: a stiff leg deadlift, which is a compound movement, with a Nordic hamstring exercise, which usually is done, it's like a glute ham raise, but done on the floor pretty much. It's usually how it's done. And it's an isolation movement. It's considered to be possibly the best isolation movement for the hamstrings, right? Possibly the best. At least maybe on a GHR it is, on the actual glute ham raise device. But these are both used as injury prevention exercises for athletes, right? So that's why it was being looked at. And what was interesting is that they noted that they hit different parts of the muscle, right? Which, you know, that's nothing new there. I think we all understand that certain exercises that work a given muscle can work different heads or origins and insertions slightly differently. They can have a slightly higher activation in different parts than the other. That's no surprise. Particularly with something like the hamstring, it's made up of three different heads. There's three different muscles involved. Well, they looked at a couple of the muscles here. Let me see which ones they looked at. It says it right there in the study. All right, they looked at the biceps femoris long head and the semitendinosus. All right, two different heads. What they noted was that the isolation type movement had a higher activation in the biceps femoris than it did in the other one, in the ST, right? It hit that head harder than the other one. Whereas they noticed the differences between them on the stiff leg deadlift were trivial, meaning it worked both heads about the same. We get over to the same thing. We talk about the proximal versus distal end of the muscle. In other words, the proximal and distal are in relation to, is it closer to the head or further away from the head? That's how that works in anatomy, for those unfamiliar with the terms. They noted there was a different proximal and distal pattern. And they noted that the distal activity was lower in one of the heads with the Nordic ham raise, the Nordic hamstring exercise, and that in the other head it was higher, and it was reversed for those two muscles. Whereas, and again, in the stiff leg deadlifts, the differences were smaller, meaning it was more evenly dispersed through the muscle. So in other words, when we looked at all the different heads, the two different heads that they studied, in both the proximal and the distal ends, there was a very much a focus with the more isolation type movement. It hit certain heads more than others, because they had four different areas they measured: the proximal and distal ends. They measured the two different muscles. And it had a definite bias, whereas the bias was much, much smaller. And between the two heads, they noticed it was a trivial difference, no really significant difference. So here's the interesting thing. This is where bias comes in. And the question I've been sitting here asking myself is Dr. Brad biased in what he said about this? Or is my bias interfering? Is it because, I mean, has more education than I do? I mean, I'm not going to argue about that. His credentials far surpass mine. But I'm looking at this same set of data, and I can see the data, and I can see the implications, and I've got my own conclusions. Dr. Brad's conclusions are, see, this goes to show us that if we want to fully develop a muscle, we need a variety of exercises, right? Because these two different exercises had a different distribution pattern. And that's how bodybuilders think. But I look at that exact same set of data, and this is going to show my bias. And if my bias is saying more and more that isolation movements aren't particularly useful, other than in some cases corrective weak point training, because I look at this and go, but they didn't have a different distribution pattern in that way, meaning it's not like one exercise just works certain heads more than the other, and then the other exercise worked different heads. That's not how it turned out. In this case, what I see is that the isolation movement works certain heads more than others. Right? It neglected certain heads, but the compound movement hit the whole muscle fairly uniformly. See the problem here? When we see data like this, I look at this and go, the overall muscle would be more balanced if we did nothing but compound movements. It was the isolation movement that's messing it up. In other words, if you did just these two exercises, you're more likely to develop muscle imbalance in the hamstring. And this is kind of the point we get to when we talk about this whole compound versus isolation thing. And this is me actually asking, and I think that we all need to ask that, am I just being biased here? Is it my bias against isolation movements? Or is the data itself suggestive that no, Dr. Brad's not right? I'm looking at this same set of data saying this one exercise is clearly inferior. This one exercise is clearly inferior for the hamstring because the other one worked the whole muscle more uniformly. And if you just did enough volume with the one big movement that worked it more uniformly, you would stimulate maximum growth in all heads. But the isolation movement wouldn't do that. You would end up with less hamstring development. So the problem we get into is that, yeah, if you start using isolation movements, you're more likely to get imbalances. That's the way I interpret this data. Now, obviously, that's just for these two exercises. We can't extrapolate every single muscle in the body to that. But it comes back to the point that I keep seeing. Every study that I see that all these various researchers who care about bodybuilding look at, I'm interpreting the data differently, you know. When I see a study like this that shows that the isolation movement put focus on certain heads more than the other, but the compound just built the whole muscle uniformly, I step back and say, wow, that's a win for compound movements. No, that's not the idea that we need multiple exercises here, is that we just did the big compounds. If we did enough of it and got strong enough at it, everything would grow maximally. That's how I interpret it. I'm not drawing the same conclusion because I don't see how doing these two exercises would be balanced. It would create imbalance. Because one of these exercises focuses on heads that the other one hits evenly. That would create imbalance. That's not useful. That's not what we want. Just like when I see a study that shows, like we have studies that I've linked in the past, that compound movements make you stronger on isolation movements than isolation movements do. Now people say, well, that should be obvious. No, it's not obvious. Because we've got studies now showing that when you gain the exact same amount of muscle inside of a muscle, like a leg extension versus a squat, that if you gain the same muscle in your quads from doing squats, you'll be stronger on the leg extension than the person who built it doing just the leg extensions. In other words, the same amount of muscle produces more strength, even when we try to isolate the muscle. Again, I see this sort of data and I see nothing but wins for compounds, and it makes me start to think that my discussion of isolation movements being useful at all might be wrong. the more research I look at, the more I've gone away from the idea that isolation movements have any value whatsoever. So I don't know. The more I look at research, the more it pushes me towards a biased direction that I didn't used to hold. It's just interesting how these things pan out, and it's just food for thought. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.